Good afternoon all, welcome to my second presentation of the afternoon on the topic of timing. When do we need one and by who? In this presentation, we will see the development of the meshed offshore grid according to the concepts that we have defined in promotion. According to this development of the meshed offshore grid, I will illustrate the non-technical actions that need to be undertaken, all of which have been discussed in the previous presentations of today. In order to quickly illustrate the difference between the concepts, I will show you a distinct part of the North Seas where the wind generation potential is the highest, namely the North Sea. In the entire period of 2020 to 2050, three distinct periods of offshore grid development may be distinguished. A startup period in 2020 to 2030, an acceleration phase in 2030 to 2040, where the installed capacity of offshore wind generation increases quickly, and a stabilization phase in 2040 to 2050. The first period in the development of the grid is characterized by the deployment of the first 525 kV 2 GW HVDC components and the construction of relatively simple multi-terminal grid structures. These structures are still limited to the national exclusive economic zones. Potential cross-border synergies are realized with the establishment of the first hybrid assets located between wind farms that are close to the border of the EEZs. In the hub concept, where the construction of artificial islands is allowed, artificial islands are already constructed in this period in all the 6 predefined locations. However, promotion does realize that construction of these islands may not be feasible by 2030. The stakeholder actions in this period are plentiful. A pilot project to test the small bidding zones model should be established and a decision made about its wider rollout. The main stakeholder involved here are the national regulatory authorities. As was discussed earlier today, an alternative solution lies in the establishment of an offshore hybrid asset classification, which mainly concerns the European Commission and the national governments. Bilateral agreements will be required to agree the regulatory framework for the connection of some offshore wind farms that are only connected to other countries than the EEZ in which they are located. These situations cannot be managed under business as usual regulation. The integration of these bilateral agreements into a future regulatory regime for the meshed offshore grid would be much smoother if at this stage the key principles of meshed offshore grid regulation and how regulatory decisions will be made across the North Seas have been agreed in the North Sea Treaty by the national regulatory authorities, the European Commission and the national governments. Additionally, due to some locally meshed configurations, anticipatory investments should be allowed by the governments or national regulatory authorities where applicable in some of the North Seas countries, especially where there is a high degree of certainty that neighboring wind farms or interconnection will be constructed. And finally, the investment models may need to accommodate different types of investors and different financial structures in this period, as investment volumes already significantly increase. This task involves mainly the TSOs, national governments. The second period in grid development sees an acceleration in the rate of offshore wind deployment, complemented by more complex cross-border multi-terminal connections and meshing. Artificial islands may be established during this period, or even before, and have their hosting capacity grow throughout this period to allow a significant amount of offshore wind to be connected. This period also marks a large increase in the deployment rate of offshore wind capacity, which means that a dedicated supply chain should be established by this time, mainly influenced by government policy. This also indicates a large opportunity for governments to increase the employment rate of skilled personnel in their countries. Due to the complexity of the meshing and potentially the introduction of small bidding zones, the remuneration of offshore wind farms, as it is regulated nowadays, will no longer be viable. Therefore, if support is still required, this should be done through a joint support scheme, implemented by the governments or NRAs. The last period in the development of the grid is a continued development of the complex structures in the grid. Multiple overlaying mesh grids may coexist in the North Sea, increasing the overall complexity of the offshore grid. The capacity increase per time period continues to rise as well, demanding a smooth, continued construction process. Where possible, more interconnection capacity is established between countries, enabling the full integration of the North Sea's markets. The earlier wind farm and grid investments will reach maturity in this period and will require life extension investment or, alternatively, decommissioning. To provide consistency on guidelines for decommissioning of offshore wind assets, such as turbines and transmission assets, guidelines should be agreed upon at an international level, such as the International Maritime Organization or through OFFSHORE. The recommendations given in this presentation are presented in this roadmap for the meshed offshore grid. For each of the recommendations, Promotion has tried to make an indication of the status of the recommendation at the moment. Additionally, we have tried to indicate the time it will take in order to prepare this recommendation before it is ready for implementation, as well as the time that is required for the implementation to be finalized. This means, for example, that although anticipatory investments are required only after 2025, preparation on its implementation will need to start today. In this roadmap, it can be clearly seen that a lot of these actions are already required to be dealt with nowadays, even though these may only be required around 2030. This is therefore also the message of Promotion. In order to establish a meshed offshore grid by 2050, we have to act now. Thank you for your attention, and again, please contact me if you have any further questions.